Hello and welcome to the first of the microeconomics podcasts for Pig at School. This topic we're going to look at costs and revenues, which is the first topic that we'll cover in year 13. The costs and revenues topic is the basis of nearly all of the diagrams we'll go through and learn in year 13, and there are a lot of diagrams. So you've got to get the definitions, how to work them out and the numbers in your head very early on to make it easier as we go along. So there'll be lots of discussion, lots of definitions in this episode for you to recap or to learn. So the first thing we'll look at are the various types of cost. So your total costs of firms are made up by adding together your fixed costs and your variable costs. So for students that have done business studies, they've got a bit of a head start here, but your fixed costs are things that don't change with output. So the best example there is rent. If you are renting a factory and you open or you're working for 5 days a week or 6 days a week, it doesn't matter, you still pay the same amount of rent. So fixed cost doesn't change with output. And then that's added to variable costs, and your variable costs do change with output. So your variable costs are the things that will vary directly. So your raw material. So if you're Walker's crisps, if you produce more crisps, you will need more potatoes. So the fixed and variable costs added together will make your total costs. So firms, when they're looking at their overall total costs, those two things are the two that are added together. Now, that's the money going out of the company. Money coming in is our total revenue. So we work out our total revenue by looking at price times quantity sold. So if we are selling packets of crisps, if we are selling packets of crisps at 50p, so that would be our price, and our quantity is 10, we are making £5. So we've got £5 coming in. Then to get to your profit level, you need to take one away from the other. So profit is where your total revenue take away your total cost. Now, if a company is making a profit, the total revenue will be greater than the total cost. If the company is making a loss, the total cost will be greater than the total revenue. Remember that just because a firm is making a loss in the short run, so in any particular year, a firm's costs might be higher than revenue, doesn't necessarily mean you're going to shut down, because hopefully they're making a profit next year. They might have made a profit previously, and you've got all the assets to add up that will be worth money. So just because you made a loss in any given year doesn't mean that the firm's going to shut down. Other types of cost we will need to know are average cost. So average cost is looking at how much it costs a company per unit of things, items made. So your average cost is worked out via your total cost divided by output. So that'd be working out how much it costs per packet of crisps on average, if we're going back to the Walker's crisps example. So average cost is total cost divided by output. So if your total cost is 100, if your output is 10, then your average cost is £10 per unit. Similarly, with the same with the revenue ones, your average revenue is going to be your total revenue divided by output or quantity, however it's worded. So again, that's just looking at how much revenue firms are getting on average per unit. In reality, these are obviously going to be very different. If you're Nike, then you're selling trainers, T-shirts, football shirts, training tops that are worth different amounts of money. So the average revenue of one item is going to be greater than the other. So average revenue just shows you for all of the items the company sells on average, how much is the company getting in. Absolutely vital component of business economics and theory of the firm, which is what we're looking at in year 13, is marginal, or the word marginal. Marginal in this case means one more. So the marginal cost. So in economics, marginal means one more. So in terms of marginal cost, it is the change in total cost from producing one more unit. And that can get that generally might get lower or higher depending on the industry as you go up. So marginal cost is if we're producing one more unit, so the difference between the last unit and the unit we're producing now, the difference in total cost. Some industries are going to have lower and higher marginal cost than others. So if you think of the marginal cost of one more passenger getting on a train, it's actually very little. So once you've already paid for the rolling stock of the train, the fuel, etc., one more passenger coming onto that train actually barely increases marginal cost at all. Whereas if it's something like drilling for oil, the first unit of drilling for that oil, where you're putting all the equipment in place, is going to be very, very large. So the marginal cost is worked out by change in total cost divided by the change in total output. But it is basically just the difference in total cost each unit. And again, very similarly, marginal revenue is the change in revenue from the additional unit. So if we sell one more unit, how much are we adding to total revenue? What is the change in total revenue? And the marginal revenue curve is going to be the same as your demand curve. And that's linked to the elasticity. If you think back to why the demand curve slopes downwards, those first people, the people at the top thinking of consumer surplus, they really want to buy the product. They're desperate for it, so they will pay a lot for it. The marginal revenue there is going to be really high. The second customer, their elasticity of demand isn't as inelastic as the first one. They'd be willing to pay a bit less, and then you go all the way down until the last few people. The price has got to be pretty low for those people to accept it. Other things or terms you're going to need to know are short and long run. So the short and the long run in economics, they do not have specific time periods. The short run in economics is where at least one factor of production is fixed. So your factors of production: land, labour, capital and enterprise. So a short run is where at least one factor is fixed. So that would generally be, if you are looking at, say, a traditional example of a factory, the fixed factor will be the factory, the actual building, which you can't change in the short run, whereas obviously in the long run you could buy a new factory. But then you've got variable factor inputs, which in that case would be the workers, and you can add more workers up to a point, and they will be your variable factors. The fixed factor would be the factory, the variable factor would be the workers. In the long run, you can change both of them. So you can change the fixed and variable factors. So in that example, that's where you'll build a second factory. And if you think of it practically, if you've got one factory, that's your fixed factor. You keep adding workers as your variable factor, but at one point they're going to fill the factory. There's not going to be enough room. So therefore, you're going to have to change your fixed factor and build a second factory. Then we've got in economics what is the very long run. Now, in the very long run, it allows for technological change. So many years ago, you'd be looking at things like the combine harvester in farming. In the last 25 years, you'd be looking at the internet and technology changes there. So the very long run allows for technological changes. We'll also need to know you'll need to remember what economies and diseconomies of scale are, which is important for our diagrams. Remember, economies of scale is when output goes up, cost per unit goes down. So average cost per unit goes down. And if you remember on the diagram, it sort of looks like the smiley face, which has got average cost on it. Originally, output is going up. Firms, remember your internal economies of scale, where you've got marketing, finance economies of scale, managerial, so people will be more specialist. So firms will get better at what they're doing. They'll get more efficient and cheaper, the greater their output. Then when they reach the very bottom of their long-run average cost curve, that's where they are productively efficient, or minimum efficient scale. It's the same thing. So that's where the average cost equals the marginal cost. That's as efficient and low cost as they can get. And then the average cost will start rising. So the average cost start rising is your diseconomies of scale. Things like it's generally down to poor levels of communication. Bigger firms, which we'll get onto with market structures next, bigger firms will argue that the economies of scale, the cost saving of the firms, big firms' monopolies, will mean that they can pass these cost savings on to customers. So it's okay that they've got a dominant market position because they will be able to pass on the cost savings in form of lower prices to customers in the long run. Going back to profits, we mentioned the profit formula earlier, which is total revenue minus total cost. Being economics, it's not quite that simple. We also have to distinguish between abnormal and normal profit. Now, this is a big difference between business or accounting profit and profit in economics, because it brings in our opportunity cost. So normal profit includes the opportunity cost of the next best thing you could be doing. If you think about that in a practical example, If you are a firm that is, it's a very basic example where you're running a cheese shop on the high street, if you knew that by turning your cheese shop into a bread shop, the bread shop would bring you £50,000 more revenue in, that opportunity cost is included in normal profit. So normal profit looks at the next best thing we could be doing with our resources, our workers, our factories, our shops. It takes into consideration that next best thing, and then any profit over that we call abnormal or supernormal profit. So normal profit takes into consideration the opportunity cost of the next best thing you could be doing with your resources, and then abnormal or supernormal profit is any profit over that. So the supernormal profit, when you see on the news that you've got Apple making these huge amounts of profit, that would be abnormal or supernormal profit because they would have already considered the opportunity cost of doing something else. And then with this large amount of profit, it's a big crux of what business economics is about. Firms really can only do two things with it. Firms can give it to their shareholders in dividends, so they can pay it back to the people that have funded them or bought shares in them, or they can spend it on investing and research and development. Now, when we get on to objectives of firms, that's a key factor. Who do we believe, basically? Do we believe, obviously it's a mix in reality, do we believe that they're giving the majority of money to their shareholders, or do we believe that they're spending it on research and development? And there's loads of practical examples. Like if you take railway companies, every year passengers complain that the price of their fares are going up. But then the railway companies will come out and say, but we're electrifying the railways. We've redeveloped stations. So they're arguing they've spent it on research and development. Customers aren't happy because they see money going to shareholders. As well as the basis of all of the diagrams you're going to learn in year 13, all of these terms, there will also be, I would say, at least 2 or 3 questions on your paper 3 multiple choice at the end of the year based on this. So you need to become quite comfortable with working out the numbers. So you might get a table of figures, and we'll do some practice on this obviously. You might get a table of figures that shows fixed cost and variable cost and the numbers underneath, and you'd have to work out the average costs. It might show you the average costs and average revenues, and you have to work out the marginal revenues and marginal costs and things like that. So in the multiple choice, you will have to work out the numbers, and again, as usual, there's no shortcutting it. You need a calculator, you need to work out the numbers and work it through. Also in the multiple choice, there will be lots of our theory of the firm diagrams in which you will have to notice something. And as well as that, all of these things, total cost, total revenue, profit levels, average cost, average revenue, marginal cost, marginal revenue, all of those things will become very familiar to you and very commonplace for your diagrams that you will have to draw throughout the year. So I will leave you on that. Those very important terms: total cost, total revenue, profit, average cost, average revenue, marginal cost, marginal revenue. It's absolutely vital that you get those terms into your head and how to work them out, and then you will need to show them on diagrams as well.